Hello, good morning, and welcome to a very sunny day. Hello, good morning, and welcome to a very sunny morning here in my part of the world. Some time ago, I was asked, how do I put my initial drawing onto my paper? Now, in reality, that's a very long and complex subject, but I'm going to share with you a couple of the things that I do and a couple of the ways that I might go about putting a drawing onto my paper ready for painting. I hope that gives you a couple of tips. There's nothing spectacular about it, but it's very useful to know. So without further ado, let's go and have a look. So the first and quite obvious way to put a drawing onto your paper is to do it freehand. I'm a bit of an advocate for freehand drawing. I am not going to say it is the be-all and end-all. It's only in the last couple of years that I've actually changed my mind, because everything I did before that was absolutely 100% freehand. And in fact, most of it is nowadays. That in itself can cause some people some problems, because not everybody has that born ability, I suppose. I'm just very lucky. I could do it from the age of 10. At 9 I couldn't, but at 10 I did. So what happened in that year, I have no idea. But I was producing quite excellent drawings for a 10-year-old way back. Very way back, as it happens. I have a site on Facebook called Freehand Artists. That's my group, and I started that because I'm very passionate about doing freehand art. However, as I said, in the last couple of years, I've had a bit of a change of mind, and there's many reasons for that. More recently, I've seen quite a professional artist, one of my favourite artists in fact, Studio Wildlife, actually openly admitting that he projects his work onto his canvas. And I must admit, I don't do that. I don't have a projector. In all honesty, it seems like a lot of hard work to me, but he projects. But he did say, and quite rightly so, that he projects, but he can also freehand. Now, it's a very important thing to be able to freehand. And some of the things that you can do apart from freehanding will help you to freehand better. But you must try as much as you can to build up a base of being able to do a reasonable freehand picture. Doesn't mean it has to be perfect, but it has to be reasonable. And then you can use these other things to help you, like projection, tracing, grids, all them sort of things. And then you can add to that other ways of freehanding, and they will all help you. You know, your tracing will help your freehand, and your freehand will definitely help your tracing. But they'll all give you better ideas of where things go, how things are proportioned, and basically what they look like. That's the biggest hurdle you really face in putting a drawing on paper, is having a full understanding of what things really do look like. People seem to have this knack of putting what they think they have seen rather than what they have actually seen. I mean, we all know what an eye looks like, but if you were to draw one and you wasn't that adept at freehand drawing, you'd probably end up drawing what you think the eye looks like rather than what the actual eye of that person looks like. So that's where tracing, in addition to your freehand drawing, can actually help you. So another way that I might draw a picture onto a piece of canvas or even a paper or card or whatever is that I will perhaps on the odd occasion use a grid. I think the grid is a great idea. However, the bit that does annoy me with a grid is the fact that if you want to scale up or scale down, it becomes a bit more difficult because there's mathematical equations got to be taken into account. If you want to double something, then it's easy, you just double the grid. But I believe if you want to half it, that becomes a bit more technical. You can't just half the grid to half the size of the paper, I believe. I'm not that qualified to tell you that, because that's not something I generally do. If I was to do a grid, I'd either do it at the same size as the picture I was using as a reference, or I would double it, or perhaps do a bit of both freehand and hand gridding. There is a way of doing that. I'll show you a bit of that freehand and what I mean in a second. Now, another way I do placing a picture onto a canvas or a piece of paper is that on the odd occasion I might trace. Now, people are probably screaming at the screen right now saying, tracing, that's cheating. Well, no, it's not. It's not cheating, because believe me, if you trace, you're getting very little out of that. Now, what you will get is correct placement and correct proportions and size, but you won't get everything you want, because it doesn't matter how much you trace. Inevitably, a lot of them lines that are more of the detailed parts of what you're doing will either disappear, or they just won't make too much sense. It's just the odd line that you can pick up on that you then have to add to freehand or with paint that will actually help you to produce that picture. You get very little out of tracing. Like I say, you can get, if you were doing a portrait, you can get eyes in the right place, mouth in the right place, nose in the right place. But things like creases and things like perhaps brow lines, all sorts of details that are in your face, especially if you're older, like me, you will get details, and you can trace them details, but the chances are you will lose all that detail as you're working. So you will then have to just try and pick up on little marks that are here and there, and that's the only way that tracing really helps you. You can always tell when somebody's traced because the drawing isn't quite so well constructed and lines are loose, and it's kind of a bit cartoonish until you start filling it in. So that's three ways, you know, you've got freehand, you've got grid, and you've got tracing. There are other types of grid. I don't really know too much about them, but there's a case for doing a circle and having diagonal lines through it. That sounds pretty much the same as a grid to me, but the mathematical equations of that, I have no idea, absolutely no idea. The other things you can use are things like rulers to get your proportions right. You can measure distance and depth. And things like this, I think it's a protractor. Do they call it a protractor? I'm not really sure. But this has all these marks around here that give you degrees of angle. So, for example, if I was doing something that needed slanted eyes, if I didn't do it freehand, I could use this to get the angle and put marks where the angle was and have a line through that angle, and then I could draw the eyes. So that helps, and there's a little ruler on the bottom of here. So one of these would be quite handy, if you can see that. Yeah, they'd be quite handy for getting angles and marks and what have you, and would save you the need of having a grid. That's just a few ways. There's other ways like projectors, like Dan uses at Studio Wildlife. He doesn't use that all the time, and nor do I. I don't use a projector, and I don't trace all the time, and I certainly don't grid all the time, and people in my art group would testify to that because they've seen me producing paintings freehand, because I never ever do that at art group, because I think it's important to show people that you can do it freehand. But if you do use something else, it's not that you're cheating, you're just kind of making your life a little bit easier. And sometimes you need that if you're doing a commission and you have a time span on that commission when it has to be completed. Sometimes it can take a long time to do a proper drawing, and sometimes you're going to need that time on your side, so it might help if you perhaps just trace the outlines. Did a grid even, but a grid would take more time than tracing. So, but there are things that are problems with tracing. So for example, if I had a photograph and somebody said to me, can you do a commission for me of this photograph, be it a portrait or a landscape or anything else for that matter, I would have to trace that if I was really up against time. But when I turn the tracing paper over, my efforts would be back to front. So what you have to do is turn the tracing paper over, draw it again, going over all your trace lines, and then turn it back again. And then you'll get it the right way. Another thing that would take away that problem is a paper called trace down, like a carbon paper. So you would put your trace down on top of your piece of paper. You would then put your reference photograph on top of that, and then you would draw around the outlines of your reference photograph. The trace down, presuming it would be the right way up, the carbon side down, would put the marks onto the paper. I don't use that because I don't like it much, and the reasons I don't like it is because the marks are not very secure and do not stay there very long, and also it means you've got to draw over your reference picture. Now that could be a photograph that you want to keep, so that's not really a very good idea. If it was a photograph that you wanted to keep, I would suggest freehand more than anything, but if you couldn't freehand it, do it with a grid, and try and proportion it up size wise. If you have a projector, obviously use that. But I'm going to show you a few examples of what I've just been talking about. And in a future video, I'm also going to give you an idea of what I use. Doesn't mean everybody would use this, but what I use to actually make them marks, so pencil or anything else, because that's a separate thing in itself. For now, I'm just showing you how to easily get picture onto your paper. So what I've done here now is I've actually got a really large piece of paper, and I've drawn rectangles here, and that's to represent smaller pieces of paper. Now the first one would be freehand, and obviously you just go directly onto the page. But what you do have to take note of is, where are you starting? Now my suggestion would be to find the centre part of what you want to be your main subject, and perhaps then just work to the centre part of the paper. What would be a problem is if you started drawing things a bit too big. So that said, when I mentioned that I kind of use a grid, that's in my head. So if I was to draw, oh, I don't know, say Mickey Mouse, right? I'd draw this freehand, right? It's not going to be the best, but it'll be a representation. Okay, so I can draw that freehand. Now, for example, if I was putting, say, the eyes in, I can just do that automatically because I just have that natural ability. But if I wanted to see how high the eyes should be, I mean, if I was to put them up there, it would look odd. And if I was to put them down here, it would look odd. So I'd want them kind of probably about there. Now, I can judge that. But if I couldn't judge that, what I could do is look at my reference, say this was the photograph now, and I could draw a line from the top of the eyes to where it would supersede into the head. And that way I'd know that the eyes would come up that high, and then I could just draw the eyes in there. With regards to the width, I could also just do that. If I found that on my reference the width of the eyes came to level with the ears, I could draw a line on that and then know that when I place it on here, I've got to go that high and that wide, and the same the other side. So I could easily do that. And if I was to put the pupil in here, you could probably do that freehand. But if you couldn't and you wanted to see how big the pupil would be, you could perhaps just use a imaginary grid line and come across and find that the top of the pupil would go there from that part of the face, and you could just put that in. So that's quite simple like that. So we'll just finish drawing Mickey. You could see that if this was something more complicated, you could use all these lines techniques to get exactly what you want. And there's the top of the eye, and there's the pupil. Alright, so that's Mickey on there. Right, so the next one would be a grid. Now, what you would do is you would find a ruler and you would decide on the dimensions of what you want your grid to be. Whatever you put on your piece of paper has to be the same as what you put on your reference photograph. We don't really want to draw on that if we don't need to, so you could actually get a bit of tracing paper and do a grid on that and put it over the top of your photograph. However, what you can do is draw the grid on your photograph and then draw exactly the same grid on here. So let's say, for argument's sake now, these are 1-inch squares, and you draw the same on there on your piece of paper, and you'd have exactly the same on your reference photograph, and each little individual box you could actually then draw. So say we would do a Mickey Mouse again, you could perhaps do that part of the ear in there, that there, and then judge. You could make even little marks in these grids if you wanted little intermittent marks to help with smaller details, and you could just go around there and draw whatever you have in the grid on your reference photograph onto the grid on your paper. Now, the other thing we have is obviously the tracing. Now, I've got myself a small piece of tracing paper here. I've cut that off of a larger book of tracing paper. My suggestion would be buy yourself at least an A3 sized pad, and then you know you've got something big enough for most pictures, but you can also cut pieces off of it. So let's say, for argument's sake now, we're going to use Mickey here as our reference photograph. What you would do obviously is place your tracing paper over the image. Now, from there you can use any pencil that you want. In this case I've got a B pencil, which is appropriate, and I can trace all the outline. I'm just doing it very quickly, so it's not going to be perfect. And you choose all the details that you want. In this case, obviously, I need every detail because it's quite simple. But if there were creases in here, the chances are that you'd end up drawing just one line. And when you come down to putting it on your piece of paper, you're going to have to work out where, in fact, the paint needs to go, because it will be slightly off. You'll probably get either the outsides or the insides of the crease, whichever is darker underneath the tracing paper, and it will kind of put things off a little bit. So you've got to be aware of that, and you've got to adjust that accordingly. From there, I take Mickey from my reference photograph, and if I then go straight over here and put him on the piece of paper, he's going to be back to front. So what I've now got to do is to obviously draw him again, which is a bit of a pain. If I was to use any method to help me with my drawing, this would actually be it, and it's a bit annoying, to be fair. So, but this is the method I use if I have to. So I'm drawing him again. Obviously do that on a piece of paper or something that it doesn't matter that you get the marks on, and obviously I'll get Mickey there. Once you get to this position where you've redrawn your picture so you can put it onto your fresh piece of paper, you need to have used a soft pencil. Anything from a B upwards, so a B, 2B, 3B, probably a 4B or a 6B would be perfect. But the softer you have it, the more likely you are to get a darker mark when you retrace it onto your piece of paper. So obviously from here, You then put it onto your fresh piece of paper, knowing full well that you've got that on both sides. And for the third time, you're now going to have to draw Mickey. Now, a couple of things you have to be aware of in doing this is that a slightly harder pencil, sharper pencil would be good, because you would get the lines pushed through. But you also do need to be careful of your pressure dependent on the paper that you use, because what you could end up with is indentation. So if I was pushing on here and I was doing it on, say, a piece of pastel mat, I could end up with an indentation, and that would be very, very hard to actually cover. So you need to be a bit aware that, yes, have a harder pencil, but be assertive rather than putting pressure on it. And every now and then, if you had a very detailed picture, you'd lift the edges up and have a look to see if you've missed any bits. And in this case, I've missed the eye. I knew I'd lost my way. So, yeah, there we go. I think I've got everything there now. Yeah, you need to keep lifting the paper. I tend to tape my paper on 4 edges and have little bits that I can lift just to look. And of course, if I do this method, which isn't that often, but you need to keep checking. But like I said, if you had all little details in here, they would come out. There we go, there's the drawing. They would come out on your drawing, but it's likely that they would not be that dark. And when you started painting, you would probably end up losing lots of these not so dark details. So you're going to have to draw it anyway. All you'd end up with is basically like this, the basics. You wouldn't end up with things like extra creases or details. You'd end up losing them. But before you start drawing, I would say in every single case, I would get a rubber and I would gently rub this out. But for me, the better way of doing it is to get either a putty rubber or a bit of blue tack and then just dab that out so you can just see the faint lines. Again, that does lend itself to you losing the picture. Then you can perhaps use your material, your medium, which is another way of putting a picture onto here, is going straight on with your medium. But that's not always the best way for numerous reasons. I'll come to that in that other video. But you can then carry on from there. Now I'm going to show you the last piece. The last way of perhaps doing this, if you wanted to, is to get yourself this piece of trace down. That's what this is, Frisk trace down. Now that is like a piece of carbon paper, and on one side it's silvery and carbony, it's actually graphite, and on one side it's not. Now the way to use this is a little bit different than tracing paper, and you won't have to keep redrawing either, so that's actually quite good. For ease, let's say this was our reference photograph now. There's no, ignore all the double-sided thing, ignore all that now, just say it's a reference photograph. What I would do is I'd get my piece of paper, I would lay this on here, preferably just tack it down on the sides, and then lay my photograph on the top, and also again tack it on its sides. Make sure you've got it in central to where you want it to be, otherwise it's going to be completely off. And then literally you would go over this like you would a piece of tracing paper. So I'm going to do that now and show you what we get. There are different brands of this tracing paper. Frisk Trace Down, I believe, is renowned to be one of the best. Not that I use it that often. I don't think I've hardly ever used it, to be fair. But the good thing about this is that the piece of carbon paper can be used over and over and over again. Now the reason you need them taped on the corners is because you still have to do this to check you haven't missed anything. I've just missed this bit here again. So with that, you can then undo your tacks, pieces of tape, whatever it is, and see your image on there. Now look, this is the reason you need to make sure you've got it exactly where you want it. So my suggestion is, if you've got a big enough piece, to cut your carbon to the size of your photograph. But if you don't, perhaps use it on one end, and make sure that you've got everything where you need it to be. Make sure that you know that your picture is that size and you can put it central, or wherever you want it, that is. So that's a few ways and just very quick demonstrations on how to do that. You know, obviously my favourite is freehand. I would say probably my second favourite would be doing the tracing, even though I have to draw it 3 times, if I had to do it that way. But of course, you would get very limited detail on that. You'd get it to begin with, but it would disappear. So you can reinforce it with the medium you're going to use before you go too far. But in all these cases, take off a lot of the graphite. I then use the grid. The annoyance with the grid is that you then have to get rid of all these lines. And again, you have to be careful of indentations in paper, this being too dark. It's kind of more annoying than the tracing, if I'm being honest. And then I'd probably look at the trace down. And the reason I'd use trace down last is because the image doesn't come out as reinforced as these. But you can see, look, there's a difference between each one of these in the intensity of the lines that I was getting. So freehand is the way to go, but if you need some help, go for one of these options, or projectors, or one of the many numerous other ways there are, which I may come to in further videos. And yeah, have happy drawing. And then you can carry on with your painting to your heart's content. I'm not going to tell you it's going to make your painting better, but what it will make better is the fact that you have everything in proportion, everything where it should be, and hopefully the composition and the perspective will be correct. So I hope you found that video interesting. There will be people that will tell you you are cheating, but believe me, I'm going to tell you that the vast majority of professional artists lend themselves to at least one of these techniques every now and then. Not always, sometimes they freehand, but if they're doing technically detailed pictures, I would put money on that 99% of these professional artists, myself included, would have what you call a lending hand. And that's to make sure you get everything correct, and to save you time is a big factor. So don't think you're cheating. There would have been a time, up to 2 years ago, I would have said that's cheating. But I've learned how to freehand draw. You need to learn how to freehand draw first. But you can use any one of these techniques to help you to freehand draw, because it will give you proper ideas of what to do and where to put everything. And it will even help you with your mastery of the pencil, in the fact that things like pressure. Until next time, please have a great day, a great week and a great year, and please look after yourselves. And above all, be kind. Take care for now. Bye.